Space, the final frontier, an infinite playground shrouded in mystery and intrigue. Since the launch of Sputnik in 1957, mankind has yearned to deepen our understanding of the cosmos above, to explore the outer reaches of space. This infatuation with interstellar travel would manifest throughout literature and film in the years that followed, but it is arguably the video game which shares the deepest connection with our love of outer space. 1962's Space War, one of the earliest video games ever created, was built on this desire to dance among the stars, and it was just the beginning. Now, 61 years later, those dreams of electronically powered galactic exploration have reached a new milestone, with the release of Starfield. Featuring more than 1,000 planets, Starfield is a rich space exploration RPG that builds on the concepts forged in Bethesda Games Studios' prior works, while taking the scope to a new level. You'll travel across countless systems and planets, exploring a wide range of settlements, cities, and desolate plains in the process. With a scale of this magnitude, however, sticking the landing is no small feat, which is where Digital Foundry comes into play. Thus today I'd like to take you through our experiences in playing Starfield. We'll begin with a tour of its visual features, from the smallest contraption to the vast landscapes above. We'll determine what works and what doesn't in Starfield. We'll then discuss the technical performance you can expect on launch day on Xbox Series X. Bethesda's prior console games have launched with numerous technical bugs and major performance issues, but is that the case with Starfield? We'll then cap everything off with my final thoughts on the game itself. Got it? Let us commence. Starfield is built on the latest iteration of Bethesda's creation engine, known as Creation Engine 2. This updated iteration of the technology boasts many visual improvements, which we'll cover today, but I want to begin by addressing the game's basic structure. Basically, how does it fit together? Well, as promised, this is an exceptionally large game. Starfield opens with a sequence introducing players to key gameplay concepts, which includes engaging in combat with pirates, taking your first space flight, which includes a battle amongst the stars, followed by the first of many visits to the city of New Atlantis, which eventually leads you to the doorstep of Constellation, an organization united by a desire to unravel the mysteries of the universe. It isn't long until you're handed full control of your ship and begin your journey across the galaxy, which immediately answers key questions on how the game came together. Basically, your ship serves as the central pillar on which everything is built. The ship shuttles you between worlds, serves as home to your crew, and can even store your cargo. You'll access the star map from within your ship and plot courses to various planets across multiple systems. As the game progresses, you can build out your ship to create something far larger than this initial vessel, but its purpose remains the same throughout. It is the glue between worlds. And this ties directly into one of the game's notable limitations. Planets and outer space itself are separate entities divided up by loading screens. Bethesda was upfront about this aspect in previews, but I can confirm that Starfield is not a seamless experience. You can observe the exterior of a planet or even open space from within your ship, but transitioning to the surface requires a loading screen. Each planet, and indeed outer space itself, is basically divided up into bespoke sections, all divided by these loading screens, but we'll discuss this in greater detail later in the video. For now though, I'd like to focus on the visual quality on display. And the ship itself is an excellent starting point for appreciating the level of detail on display in Starfield. Granular visual nuance has not been a strong point for Creation Engine in the past, but with Starfield, the level of detail has been improved significantly. Zoom in on any control panel or surface within your ship, and you'll be amazed at the level of granularity on display. Every single button, switch, or knob is fully modeled with high-resolution textures slathered across it, indicating its purpose. Most of these surfaces are little more than background visual noise, but it contributes greatly to immersion. This is further enhanced by a vastly improved PBR materials pipeline. Seriously, just look at this landing bay hatch, it's gorgeous. Something I never thought I'd say about a landing bay access hatch. Metal, plastic, and the like all look remarkably tactile. There's so much more nuance packed into such a small space, and I was genuinely surprised by the leap in fidelity over their prior games. Once you've absorbed the ins and outs of your ship, however, it's time to venture forth, and this is exactly what sets Starfield apart from prior Bethesda games. Fundamentally, it's about variety. In a game like Skyrim or Fallout, players are confined to a somewhat repetitive environment. You'll spend your time exploring aesthetically similar locations from start to finish. This isn't a knock, of course, it's just that each of these games take place within one specific world. With Starfield, however, Bethesda is able to go beyond that. Many planets have drastically different cities and environments to explore compared to other locations. New Atlantis, for instance, is the first major city you'll visit. It boasts glass structures towering above the player, reflecting the sun across its surface. Manicured gardens and vegetation fill in the gaps, and crowds swarm the numerous loading platforms. It's a bustling and interesting place to explore, reminiscent of the Citadel in Mass Effect. Each location boasts a real-time time-of-day system simulating the rotation of the planet on which you inhabit. But this is just the beginning. Venture forward and you'll find vastly different locations. Take Aquila, for instance, which is a run-down, walled, Old West-style town reminiscent of Fallout, but with high-tech flourishes. This bustling oasis serves as the base of operations for the Freestar Rangers, and you'll become rather familiar with it as you play. It boasts a vibe that differs so completely from New Atlantis that it almost feels like a different game entirely. Impressively, the level of detail we observed within your ship remains high, even when exploring various installations. There are a ton of props scattered around every environment, lending it that lived-in feel, and each of these props is intricately detailed when examined. Plus, the interior spaces themselves tend to look great too. It's all a gigantic leap over any prior Bethesda game, that's for sure. One peek at Fallout 4 and you should see what I'm talking about. But there's an even greater difference when you look at something like Neon, a cyberpunk-esque city decked out with blinding signage, huge crowds, and nightmarish metallic structures choked by cables. The entire city is built on an otherwise deserted planet of water, held high on sturdy pylons. It's a location quite unlike anything ever featured in a Bethesda game, and it fills the role of an underground criminal paradise. Cities such as Neon rely heavily on reflections with variable roughness of water-soaked materials influencing their appearance. Mirror-like puddles combine with rough cement and metal to create convincingly damp surfaces. This reveals that Bethesda is still relying entirely on cube maps for generating the reflections rather than SSR, planar, or ray-traced reflections. In many scenes, these cube maps are aligned within the scene itself to somewhat match the surroundings and create a coherent image, but you'll equally discover places where that's not the case. If you jump back over to New Atlantis, the limitations become more obvious. Reflections across bodies of water, for instance, rarely line up with the scenery and of course completely omit dynamic objects. Water rendering also appears rather flat when viewed from a distance, and doesn't seem to have been radically improved over prior Creation Engine titles. Now, in service to the gameplay, while exploring these cities you'll engage with a wide range of characters. This has always been an area of weakness for Bethesda Games Studios titles, but improvements have been made with Starfield. When engaged in conversation, for instance, the camera focuses on the character speaking while the background elements appear out of focus, relying on a gorgeous bokeh depth of field effect. Facial animation is fairly simple, but it gets the job done and matches the spoken lines. Given the vast range of characters you'll interact with, it works well enough. Now, if you stop and more closely examine these characters though, the game reveals an impressive array of detail crafted into their outfits, especially for those donning spacesuits. The physically based materials really shine, lending the game an additional sense of realism. There's a real distinction between all the different fabrics and metals that a character might be wearing. So while the animation isn't especially impressive, the actual level of detail is, and it is an absolutely gigantic leap over Bethesda's prior games. That said, perhaps unsurprisingly, NPCs wandering around the game world are significantly less impressive, to say the least. The geometric detail is certainly ample, but the lighting and lack of subsurface scattering really holds things back. Still, the NPCs fulfill the role of creating an illusion of a bustling environment, which ultimately is their purpose. Of course, as a Bethesda game, it's no surprise that character creation is a significant focus here. The system is indeed pretty flexible. Fallout 4 offers a tactile approach which has you directly manipulating facial features, but in Starfield, the number of variables has been increased, shifting the game back to more of a menu-driven interface, which allows for more subtle adjustments of your character. The hair, clothing, and skin rendering, while not cutting edge, look pretty good overall and are a big step forward for a game like this. Now, of course, where Starfield differs most from its forebears lies in how its environments are presented to the player. You see, each major city or settlement occupies its own planet rather than being situated within a singular, seamless world. You can't just walk from New Atlantis to Aquila for obvious reasons. They're on different planets. But that doesn't mean there aren't things to find outside the city limits. You may uncover additional locations ranging from research stations, abandoned factories, and any number of other places. Quests, resource gathering, conversations, base building, and more are all designed to take advantage of these planetary landscapes. By dividing up all these large cities, however, it creates this additional space between each of them, meaning that each planet remains relatively sparse compared to prior Bethesda worlds. But these areas outside the city limits rely on engine features to build atmosphere, which is where the environment and lighting comes into play. There are supposedly more than 1,000 planets in this game, but each of them rely on the engine's new visual features to build that atmosphere. The single largest improvement in my book stems from the new volumetric effects. It's used very nicely in cities, of course, and you even get these nice particles that are lit by signs and neon. But it also helps shape large expanses of terrain, thanks to pockets of height fog filling the valleys. As expected, most planets do rely heavily on procedurally generated terrain that does produce a decent variety of locales. There are steep, mountainous areas reminiscent of something like Skyrim, I suppose, but also flat, desolate moons, deserts, ice planets, and more. Variable weather and time of day both influence the presentation as well. Sometimes clear views are possible, other times it's concealed by fog. Crucially, objects such as rocks, trees, structures, and the like all remain largely visible at a distance, but there is some mild pop-in for smaller objects such as grass. If you watch closely, you'll notice these things popping into view as you close the distance, much like most other open world games. Still, the view distance feels as if it's been pushed out a great deal since Bethesda's prior games. As far as distance shadowing, this is taken into account for larger objects, but the game relies on a mix of cascaded shadow maps and screen space shadows for smaller objects such as foliage. Starfield also boasts a new global illumination solution. You can see this here with the way the rocks take on an orangish hue as the sun bounces off the soil on this planet. The sun in this system then radiates blue light, and that light can be observed across the surface of this nearby moon. The game does not make use of per-pixel ray tracing, however, it should be noted, neither on Xbox nor on the PC, but the solution used in this game is still reasonably effective at handling indirect lighting situations, and is competitive with other non-ray traced solutions. That said, there are plenty of areas where this doesn't fully hold up to close scrutiny, with shadowed regions appearing overly bright instead, but this is to be expected with a non-RT solution. Maybe someday we'll see ray tracing added in Starfield Special Edition? While we're talking about the world then, I also wanted to showcase some of the game's texture work in areas outside of your ship. The resolution of these textures is excellent, and the material work is largely well done. I would say that metals, leather, and stone fare best in this regard, More natural materials are perhaps a little less realistic to the eye, and the quality does vary per environment, to some degree at least. But of course, given the scale of the game, it's unsurprising that you'll also find some pretty unsightly textures if you look close enough. Weapon models also look excellent, with some seriously impressive surface detail. Post-processing effects also deserve a special mention given how prior Bethesda games were weak in this area. I mentioned the bokeh depth of field earlier in the video, but it deserves a second shout because it just looks great. It's not only used in conversation, but also when aiming down the sights of your weapon, and can be used in photo mode too. More importantly, Bethesda worked with the fine folks at id Software to implement a new per-pixel motion blur, something absent in every other creation engine game to date. Given that it's a 30 frames per second experience on Xbox, it's critical too, as it greatly improves the perception of fluidity even at this lower frame rate target. I would have liked to see a shutter speed adjustment option in the menu, of course, as it's a little on the light side, but it still contributes greatly to the presentation. For the heathens though, you can disable it, and the same goes for film grain for that matter, which also looks great. Of course, while Starfield generally looks great to the eye, it's not always pristine. Much of this comes down to the scope of the game. With so many planets and a heavy reliance on procedural generation, eagle-eyed players will be able to poke holes in the presentation. This isn't surprising, but there are a few spots near major cities that felt slightly undercooked. Case in point, if you leap down into the water surrounding New Atlantis to observe the waterfalls, you may notice this unusual mist effect exhibiting obvious sorting issues. In fact, the specific area around the city feels like it's lacking detail. When combined with the basic cube map reflections across the water, it feels a little out of place. The water also surprises me. There's no swimming in Starfield. It will break your fall if you jump from a great height, as I just did, but diving is forbidden. You just glide along the surface like a flailing guppy. Still, when looking across the game as a whole, I feel that Bethesda has done a commendable job with the game's visuals. From a pure rendering standpoint, Starfield is not cutting edge, but the team have managed to create something that I would genuinely call beautiful, most of the time at least. It's a better looking game than anything the team has ever produced. But okay, I think we've discussed the visuals enough at this point, so let's tackle the game's structure and put its systems to the test. I'd like to walk through some basic navigation first to better lay down the basics. So we'll begin here in Constellation HQ, where I've selected a mission on planet Aquila. Let's begin by making our way back to our ship. As I leave the compound though, we'll encounter our first loading screen. Keep this in mind. Now from here, we'll take a stroll through New Atlantis, eventually making our way towards the tram station. This will take us down to the spaceship, and by extension, our ship. Once you reach the tram, you simply select your destination and you're greeted by the next loading screen. Alternatively, it is possible to reach the spaceport on foot using some acrobatic skills, so this loading screen amounts to fast traveling basically. Now once on the ground level, let's go ahead and find our ship over at the spaceport. Upon arrival, another brief loading screen awaits us as we transition from the exterior to the ship interior. From here then, we can hop behind the controls of our craft and take off. I also noticed that FSR2 doesn't play nicely with this structure to the left. After another loading screen, we then find ourselves suspended above the planet from which we departed, and to our left, an indicator highlights our objective. So this is the reality of space travel in Starfield. Basically, the game loads a small zone around the player, and within this zone, there are a variety of interactive elements including hostile and friendly vessels, asteroids, space stations, mines, and more. But the planets visible around you are a mere illusion. You cannot travel between these 2 points in space. To visit any other planet requires you to utilize the galaxy map system. You simply point to a place of interest and initiate fast travel. But it's a curious thing. You see, on one hand, the feeling of taking a journey across the stars is largely absent, as reaching any destination in this game is simply a click or two away via the map system. There's really no sense of actual space exploration here. It's about the destination, not the journey. Yet, in reality, space travel itself would largely be devoid of anything interesting. The time required to fly to another planet would result in boredom, I'd imagine. Given this, I understand their approach then in Starfield, but I do wish a middle ground had been established, something that helps capture the sense of exploring these distant worlds without the reality of interstellar travel. It's also worth mentioning that the galaxy map is always just one click away. You remember back in Constellation HQ, I didn't need to actually walk all the way to my ship. You can just as easily bring up the menu, select your destination, and touch down on a new planet within seconds. Something which does kind of ruin the illusion of great distance between galaxies. However, there are benefits to this design, and item persistence is the big one that everyone's talking about. Basically, the game tracks the state of many different things across the entire universe, from the position of doors, item locations, the bodies of those left behind after a firefight, and other such things. But I wanted to put it to the test, so let's jump back to Aquila. Prior to landing on the planet for this most recent test, I had made a prior stop. You see, inside this establishment, I gently placed my collection of soap dispensers here in the corner on the rightmost toilet stall. I then closed the stall door and went about my business, my other business. I completed various missions across multiple planets at this point, and then used that save to demonstrate the structure of the game starting at Constellation HQ. Let's rewind to back when I landed on Aquila then. I had visited at least 10 different planets by this point. So let's go check the restroom. Are my bottles still there? Well, good news folks, they are. It worked. So yeah, I can confirm that across the entire game, Starfield does keep track of items like this. It's one of those things that separates a Bethesda game from the rest of the pack. Pretty cool, right? One last thing I want to mention though is the limitation placed on exploring planets. It's true, you cannot walk around an entire planet. Basically, when you land your ship, the game seems to generate a large area around the player for exploration, but if you walk too far in any direction, you will bump up against this screen. Yeah, it's a little jarring at first, but honestly, there isn't much of a reason to venture out across planets. It's mostly just empty wasteland on every planet. Walking around an entire planet sounds cool on paper, but in reality, it would likely be rather boring. So yeah, on paper, Starfield functions pretty much like any other Bethesda game, with plenty of segmentation. It only really feels more egregious this time due to the increased frequency of fast travel due to the way everything's divided up into planets. The segmentation itself isn't necessarily a big deal, but the length and frequency of loading screens does become frustrating over time. When folks noted that Starfield is really nothing like No Man's Sky or Star Citizen, they were exactly right. It is not like those games. This is an RPG with space as a background, not an actual space simulation. So what's next then? Well, by the time you're watching this, Oliver's initial video covering the performance on Xbox Series X and S will have gone live, but I wanted to add a couple notes of my own. Firstly, my experience is on par with what Oliver presented. There are hiccups in major cities, but it's largely a stable 30 frames per second even in combat. I did notice that engaging in combat within these large cities can exacerbate the drops a little bit, but it's still far beyond anything Bethesda has shipped on consoles in the past. In fact, there seems to be enough headroom here that I feel a performance mode might be feasible. At least a mode designed for VRR displays targeting 60 FPS. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if this were added at a later date. Oh, and while this is a console-focused video, I did want to mention that the PC version can run above 60 frames per second. It does not share the same physics issues that older Bethesda games exhibit. I'd forgot about this limitation until I attempted to capture some Skyrim, where the intro completely bugged out due to running at 120 frames per second. I did enjoy the spinning horse though.
You. Stay awake.
The other note on performance centers around loading times. After playing the game for nearly 30 hours, I found that loading times between different planets had slightly increased since I first started. Remember the loading test from earlier? Yeah, those same loading screens are faster when using a clean save. This is not entirely unexpected, as it's something we've seen in prior Bethesda games, but I am curious to see how much this will vary the further you play. Also, even with a clean save, the loading times are surprisingly long in this game, especially when loading from the main menu. We've become accustomed to ultra-fast loading this generation, but Starfield doesn't really get there. The other technical issue I'd like to raise centers on HDR. The game natively supports HDR, but its peak brightness is severely capped, while black levels are raised. In fact, black levels are raised in both SDR and HDR, leading to a generally washed out image. I actually adjusted my TV to compensate for this, which is something you shouldn't need to do. I suspect that this is an intentional choice on the part of the developers, however, but I would like to see an options menu to allow users to adjust the peak brightness, paper white and black levels in HDR, and the contrast in SDR. Speaking of missing options, the game also lacks an FOV slider on any platform, though on PC it is possible to change the setting via an INI file, which is kinda classic Bethesda. Still, despite these criticisms, I was generally surprised and impressed by how stable the game is overall given their track record. 30 frames per second isn't exactly a high frame rate, I get it, but it's almost always perfectly stable, which is something we've never had in a new Bethesda console game before. Now, as we start to wrap things up, I want to give special mention to the game's audio as well. For starters, Inon Zur composed the soundtrack to Starfield, and it's phenomenal, hugely atmospheric with powerful themes driving the experience throughout. But the sound effects work is equally impressive. It does make full use of surround sound, enveloping you in the action, but what I really love is the way in which the sound playback varies based on the environment. Listen to this demonstration as I move from the surface of the moon to an interior space. Note how the sound changes once we're indoors.
Can't concentrate.
Great stuff, right? So how about the game itself? Well, as I noted earlier, Starfield is a Bethesda RPG at its core, as you'd expect. In practice, it feels like a blend of something like Skyrim or Fallout with the original Mass Effect. It's driven by a huge selection of interesting and often unexpected quest lines. Land on an empty planet and you may end up stumbling on some event that leads to an entirely new area. Breaking the world up into various planets also means increased variation in the types of environments you'll explore. Taking a mission on a rocky planet feels very different from infiltrating a high-tech base, for instance. I've often taken issue with open world games and the endless amount of traversal they typically involve. Yet weirdly enough, Starfield's segmentation kinda works against this issue. You'll spend more time actually doing things in Starfield than simply walking forward. That's not to say you can't go off and explore the planet if you want to, but simply running across a landscape isn't really the primary goal here. Plus, some of the core mechanics, like basic combat, feel a lot better than they ever did in any prior Bethesda game. Damage values are still RPG based, so you can't just blitz through enemies like you're playing Doom Eternal, but the weapons actually have proper kickback and excellent animations. Plus, the planets have variable gravity, and you even have a jetpack, so getting around the world feels great too. Vehicles could have been a fun addition, but given the way the game's set up, it probably doesn't make sense. Honestly though, there's a lot more I could say about Starfield, and I will share more of these thoughts in a dedicated DF Direct video on Starfield. But for now, I think it's fair to say that despite some of the flaws I mentioned in this video here today, I greatly enjoyed my time with Starfield, and will continue to play. It doesn't push any new technical boundaries in terms of visual quality, but the consistency and the quality of the game itself is extremely impressive, especially given the scale. But that's going to do it for this video. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and if you did, be sure to let us know, and we'll see you in the far reaches of space.